The moment my access badge went dead, the room decided I no longer existed. The glass atrium of the Whitmore Tower was a cathedral of manufactured success, packed with cameras and executives who had practiced their applause in front of mirrors. Julian Whitmore stood at the mahogany signing table, smiling like the future had already apologized to him for the wait. He didn't look at me when he reached for my quarterly report, the one that had taken me 6 months and 3 sleepless weeks to perfect. He tore it in half. Then again, letting the white scraps flutter to the floor like confetti no one had invited. "High-end help," Julian said, projecting his voice to the gallery. He didn't look at me. He looked at the cameras. Sometimes you have to clear the clutter to see the view. The word help landed like a slap. Behind him, a hand signaled. The security team moved with practiced efficiency. Above us, the massive digital screens flickered, the corporate blue bleeding into a harsh, pulsing crimson. "Access denied." The words echoed against the glass. "A digital execution." I didn't flinch. I am Calla Whitmore. I am 42 years old. I repeated these facts as an anchor while the lead guard's fingers clamped around my bicep. Julian glanced at his Patek Philippe, impatient for the room to be cleansed of my presence. He wanted me gone before the press noticed the foundation was leaving the building. I checked my own watch. 9 a.m., exactly on schedule. The guard tugged, but I didn't stumble. I leaned toward Julian, close enough to smell his expensive cologne and the faint scent of desperation he hadn't realized he was wearing yet. "You just locked the only door that could have saved you." "Julian," I whispered. His smile didn't fail, but his eyes did. A flicker of uncertainty gone in a second. They marched me toward the exit. The badge reader chirped a sharp, electronic rejection as we passed. I had built the systems they were celebrating. I had authored the safeguards they ignored. As the cold Pittsburgh air hit my face, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a fuse that had just been lit. They handed me a cardboard box that was already creased, as if it had been waiting in a dark corner for my specific failure. I packed with surgical precision. When you've spent 20 years building an empire, you don't give the onlookers the satisfaction of a frantic exit. I took the chipped mug, the dead succulent, and the notebooks filled with code they'd never decipher. A shadow fell across my desk. It was Marcus, Julian's newest lapdog. He didn't look at me. He looked at my monitor, where my name had already been scrubbed. In its place, in a sterile, bold font, was Julian Whitmore, Chief Strategist? "The drive is missing," Marcus muttered, his eyes darting to my drawer. "He already stole it," I replied, my voice as level as a horizon. "Tell him I hope he enjoys the contents." Across the floor, Julian's laugh cut through the office, a sharp, jagged sound. He was surrounded by directors. Grandstanding in front of the master dashboard I'd designed, he was explaining his new streamlined workflow, his hands moving like a conductor's. The directors nodded, eager to worship the new sun. They saw green lights. They saw stability. I saw a delicate ecosystem of timed authorizations and recalibrated thresholds. Julian thought he'd stolen a masterpiece. In reality, he'd hijacked a high-speed train and fired the engineer while the tracks were still being laid. My phone buzzed. A private message from a ghost in compliance. "They flagged your credentials as restricted, not terminated. They're scared. Calla." I didn't reply. I just watched the dashboard. A single pixel flickered a micro stutter in the data flow that only its creator would recognize. The first tremor of a coming earthquake. "We've removed the unnecessary friction." Julian's voice boomed, referring to the safety checks I'd spent a decade perfecting. I lifted my box. It was surprisingly light. As I walked toward the elevator, the green lights reflected in the glass seemed paler, flickering against a darkness they weren't prepared to handle. The announcement hit my phone before my coffee could even cool. Julian's face dominated the live stream, his jaw set in that specific brand of unearned confidence. The headline scrolled beneath him in aggressive gold. "A new era Whitmore Corp announces historic merger." I sat in the corner of a dimly lit bistro across from the tower, watching the reflected sunlight hit the boardroom windows. Inside, I knew they were sipping vintage champagne. Julian was at the podium, his voice booming through the feed about synergy and unprecedented velocity. He was talking about the Vane Group. I didn't need to download the prospectus. I knew Vane better than Julian knew his own reflection. 2 years ago, as a corporate cleaner for a silent private equity firm, I had been the one to sign the seizure orders that froze Vane's offshore accounts. I had personally locked their metaphorical doors because they were a hollow shell built on predatory debt and falsified invoices. Julian hadn't just bypassed my review. He had sprinted away from it. He'd traded the company's stability for a partner that was effectively a financial corpse, hoping the smell wouldn't reach the shareholders until his bonus cleared. I scrolled through the leaked term sheets on my tablet. It was a disaster. No audits. No force majeure protections. Julian had stripped away every safeguard I'd spent a decade installing. Viewing my caution as friction, he'd tied his family's legacy to a sinking anchor and was currently throwing a party on the deck. Suddenly, my phone vibrated, not a notification, but a call from an encrypted number. The liquidity trigger is active. A distorted voice said without a greeting. He signed the master agreement 10 minutes ago. He just gave us the keys to the house. Kala. I looked back at the tower. The applause from the live stream was deafening. But all I could hear was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Good, I said, standing up and leaving my untouched coffee behind. Let's see how long he can tread water. The conference call didn't come from a desk phone. It came from an unlisted server. That was the first red flag. The second was the silence that lingered before anyone dared to breathe. Kala, the HR director began. Her voice a forced silk. We're looking at a procedural hiccup. A $50 million discrepancy in the Vane merger. It seems your final sign-off was never logged. Julian didn't wait for her to finish. His voice cut in, sharp and frantic, vibrating with a kind of ego that was starting to crack. It's a paperwork error. Kala, we need you to log into the portal and backdate the compliance memo. 10 minutes of your time, and we can discuss a very generous severance. Or we can discuss why the SEC is looking for a fall guy. I leaned back in my chair, the dim light of my apartment reflecting off my laptop screen. I wasn't just listening. I was watching the metadata. They were calling from a burner line. You don't need a signature, Julian, I said, my voice dropping into a register of icy calm. You need a sacrificial lamb. You realized 40 minutes too late that Vane's debt is tied to a predatory lending loop, a loop I put in place years ago. The silence on the other end was absolute. I could almost hear Julian's heart hammering against his ribs. Listen to me, you arrogant bitch, Julian hissed, dropping the facade. I am a Whitmore. My name is on the building. Yours is on a cardboard box in a dumpster. Sign the memo, or I'll make sure you never handle a penny of private equity again. I'll bury you in litigation until you're 90. I didn't flinch. I just pressed save on the recording. Threats are the last refuge of a man who has already lost. I told him, I'll see you at the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. I'll even bring my own pen. I hung up before he could scream. My phone buzzed immediately with a mandatory summons. I didn't need to read it. The trap was set, but Julian was the one walking into it. The boardroom was a vacuum. Phones were stacked like dead weights. Laptops were shuttered. It was the kind of silence that didn't signify peace, but a collective agreement to look the other way. I took the seat at the foot of the table, the exile's chair. Julian was absent, likely hiding in a glass office, but his father, Arthur Whitmore, sat at the head. He didn't look like a man facing a crisis. He looked like a man who owned the concept of truth. The minority shareholders requested your testimony, Arthur said. The word testimony tasting like ash in his mouth. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I slid my tablet into the center of the mahogany table. On the screen, a forensic map bloomed, a digital web of wire transfers routed through Vane's shell companies and looping back into Julian's private equity accounts. It wasn't just a procedural hiccup. It was a $50 million heist. This is interpretation, a director snapped, his face flushing. In a merger of this scale, integration costs are fluid. It's not fluid when the destination is a Cayman Island account registered to your CEO's son, I countered. I looked at each of them. Their eyes didn't show shock. They showed calculation. They weren't afraid of the crime. They were afraid of the sunlight. Arthur finally looked at me. His gaze was ancient and cold. We will handle this internally. Calla, your services are no longer required. For the sake of your career, I suggest you forget the geography of these accounts. It was a dismissal and a threat wrapped in a father's protection. As security stepped forward, the same two men from Chapter 1, I stood up slowly. I didn't fight. I didn't plead. I leaned over the table, my voice a low, lethal hum. Check the lease for this building. Arthur, specifically. Clause 14.4. You'll find that when the tenant is under federal investigation for fraud, the ownership reverts to the primary creditor. I felt the air leave the room. I'm not the help anymore, I whispered. I'm the landlord. I walked out before the first protest could form. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Clause 14.4 triggered. The locks change at midnight. The silence in the hallway was thick, the kind that follows a grenade blast before the ears start to ring. Behind me, the boardroom doors remained sealed, but I could feel the frantic energy through the wood. Julian's father would be reaching for a phone. The lawyers would be scrambling for a binder that hadn't been opened in a decade. I didn't wait for the elevator. I walked toward the emergency stairs, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic countdown on the marble. My phone vibrated. No caller ID. Calla, Arthur Whitmore's voice was a low growl, stripped of its previous boardroom polish. What did you do to the lease? I didn't do anything to it. Arthur, I said, pushing open the heavy stairwell door. I simply bought the debt that holds it. You spent so much time looking at the horizon of the Vane merger that you forgot to look at the ground beneath your feet. This is a headquarters, not a pawn shop. You can't just buy a skyscraper, he hissed. In Pittsburgh, you can, if the holding company is delinquent on its tax credits and the primary creditor is a trust I've managed for years. Clause 14.4. In the event of a material misrepresentation of assets by the tenant, the lease is voidable at the discretion of the owner. I paused on the landing. I'm exercising that discretion. As of 9:00 a.m., Whitmore Corp is trespassing. The silence on the other end was absolute. He wasn't just losing money now, he was losing the very walls that defined his name. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice sounding old frail. I want the truth about the $50 million, Arthur, and I want Julian to be the one to hand me the keys. I hung up. Outside, the Pittsburgh fog was lifting, revealing the steel skeleton of the city. For the first time in years, the view didn't look like a challenge. It looked like a map. The call came while I was sitting in my car, the engine idling in a dark corner of the parking structure. I wasn't just Calla Whitmore, the fired analyst. I was Calla Whitmore, the managing director of Aegis Capital. Aegis, Arthur's voice cracked over the speaker. You're telling me my primary creditor has been sitting in my cubicles for 5 years? That's corporate espionage. It's called distressed asset monitoring. Arthur, I replied, watching the security guards through my rearview mirror. Aegis doesn't just lend money to legacies. We ensure those legacies don't burn our capital. I wasn't an employee. I was a structural integrity test. And your son just failed it. I opened a file on my dashboard. It was a map of Whitmore Corp's debt, a tangled web of rolling notes and waived covenants that I had personally managed from the shadows. You waived the ethical indemnity clause when you pushed the Vane merger, I continued, my voice clinical. The moment Julian asked me to backdate that memo, he triggered a bad actor provision under the swap agreement. Aegis now has the right to convert all outstanding debt into voting equity, effectively immediately. You can't do this. Julian's voice suddenly screamed into the line. He sounded small, like a child realized the floor was actually lava. I'll sue you into the dirt. With what money? Julian, the $50 million you moved to the Caymans that's been frozen by a Mariva injunction as of 3 minutes ago. The silence that followed was the heaviest yet. It was the sound of an empire realizing it was actually a house of cards, and the wind had just started to blow. I'm not coming back to save you, I said, like putting the car in gear. I'm coming back to foreclose. I drove toward the exit, for the first time. The gate didn't just open, it felt like a salute. The board meeting stalled on a frozen slide. Julian was mid-sentence. His hands spread wide as if he were blessing the room with his presence. When his tablet went black, he tapped the glass once, then harder, on the wall behind him. The high-definition projector flickered, his growth projections vanishing in their place. A single line of red text burned into the screen, credentials revoked, access suspended. Someone let out a nervous laugh that died instantly. A phone buzzed at the far end of the table. Then another. It was a digital wave. A chorus of haptic vibrations signaling the arrival of the ethics violation notice I had triggered from the lobby. I walked in just as the general counsel stood up, her face draining of color as she read the legal headers from Aegis Capital. Julian spun toward the head of the table. Dad, what does this tell it to fix the server? Arthur Whitmore didn't look at his son. He was staring at his own screen, his lips moving silently as he calculated the math of his own destruction. I didn't rush to my seat. I stood at the threshold, watching the chaos. The microphones on the table cut out with a sharp pop. The smart glass windows of the boardroom tinted to opaque black, sealing the room. I stepped forward and placed a matte black Aegis access card on the mahogany surface. It didn't slide. It landed with a heavy, final thud. The server isn't broken. Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. It's performing exactly as I programmed it to, under the bad actor provision of your debt covenant. Your voting rights were transferred to me 60 seconds ago. Julian pushed back his chair, the screech of metal on marble loud enough to make the directors flinch. You can't do this. This is my name. This is my building. It was your building, I corrected him, checking my watch. As of now, you're just a guest who has overstayed his welcome. And the locks have already changed. Julian broke first. He lunged to his feet so violently his chair clattered against the marble floor. His palms slammed the mahogany table, rattling the crystal water glasses. His voice was raw, a jagged edge of family legacy and unearned ego. He screamed about his father's bloodline, about the help for getting their place, about the decades his name had been etched in Pittsburgh steel. The words were a frantic attempt to scream reality back into the shape he wanted. No one moved to defend him. The directors sat like statues, their eyes fixed on anything but him. Arthur tried to intervene, his voice a low, desperate vibration. Calla, think of the market. Think of the optics. We can settle this in a private room. He was still bargaining. He still thought this was a negotiation. There is no private room. Arthur, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The silence in the room was mine now. You're not the owners anymore. You're just caretakers who forgot to pay the rent and stole from the till. I looked directly at Julian. His face was a mask of pale, sweating fury. You called me the help on Monday, I said, my voice echoing in the opaque glass chamber. Today, I'm the one letting you go. Termination for cause, embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. I tapped the confirm icon on my tablet. A dual notification chimed on every screen in the room. The official SEC filing was live. Julian's digital identity was scrubbed from the building's infrastructure in real time. Security, I called out. The side doors opened, not the main entrance where the cameras waited, but the service exit, the one used for trash and deliveries. 2 guards stepped in. They didn't look at Julian with the fear they had yesterday. They looked at him like an obstacle. Julian looked around for an ally, a friend, a legacy. He found only the service door. It's over, Julian, I said as the guards took his arms. Don't forget your box on the way out. The door clicked shut behind them. A soft, muffled sound. The sound of a name becoming a footnote. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where the Whitmore ego used to be. No one moved. A director reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling, then pulled back as if the act of drinking required a vote. I didn't sit in the head chair. I stood at the window, watching the Pittsburgh fog finally burn off the river. The general counsel slid a thick binder toward me. The title was embossed in gold interim chief executive. I didn't even open it. I'm not taking the seat, I said. My voice was a calm vibration in the still air. Kala, the markets need a face. The board is willing to offer. The markets need a foundation, not a face. I interrupted. I pulled a pre-drafted document from my folder, a term sheet for a structured sale to a legacy-focused private equity firm. Here are the terms of the acquisition. It includes a 5-year employment guarantee for all staff below the executive level. The Whitmore name is removed. The debt is settled. The poison is out. I initialed the final page. I took what was owed to Aegis Capital to the penny. Not a cent more for vengeance, not a cent less for mercy. As I walked toward the door, a junior analyst, the same one who had watched me being escorted out a week ago, stood by the elevators. He didn't clap. He simply nodded, his back a little straighter than it had been before. He was the one who would build what came next. Outside, the air didn't feel lighter. It felt sharper. I walked away from the tower without looking back. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. True power isn't about owning the room. It's about knowing you're the only one who has the key to the exit.